This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Ending Life Talk Radio.
Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to the TNT show, The Nation Talks. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Today we hear that Prime Minister Johnson is hiring a spokesperson to stand in for him during televised interviews. He's going to pay this character 100,000 a year of your taxpayer pounds to speak for him. Now there are rumours, unverified, that Jane Godley has applied for the post. And so we're all looking forward to the first time she shouts, "Boris, get the door." Hello, I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60, we expect, exciting minutes. Thanks for joining us this evening. We have yet another great guest, and I'm really excited that he's been able to join us. Stay tuned to hear from Scotland's foremost authority on broadcasting. And he is taking your questions. But first, a few words about TNT. TNT, as you know, stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We take your questions ahead of showtime and during the show live. The details are on your screen now. And if you can't use any of those, you can write to me at john@cleash.com and we'll try and fit in as many of your questions as we possibly can. And tonight, we have a first for the TNT show. We are running a poll on Facebook and we're asking you if you agree that there should be a statue to Andrew Watson, the world's first black footballer, capped 3 times for Scotland. And now to our guest. Tonight, the nation talks to Stuart Cosgrove. Most of you will know Stuart perhaps from Off the Ball. What you may not know is that Stuart has likely forgotten more about broadcasting than most people know. Stuart, how are you coping with COVID-19?
Well, you know what, John, it's a very, very challenging period of time. And I'm actually enjoying this particular week, almost like a week off, because my son, Jack, and my partner have gone over to Arran for a few days to a friend's cottage. And it's left me in the house alone, and I can do what the hell I want. But, you know, I'm catching up. I've got a big kind of backlog of writing that I've got to do. So I've been just really focusing on that and periodically going out to do the odd shop at the local grocery, but nothing big or significant. And I'm actually a wee bit of a sociable loner. I quite like being on my own, and I quite like being in the house and just doodling around and catching up with things and whatever. So this week, not bad. But I tell you what, there's been some difficult times, John, because I had a period, 2 or 3 days, where I was really not that great at all. I was just kind of feeling very depressed about it all. And I'm used to having a busy life, going in and out of studios and things like that. And having to homeschool the wee man, who's an absolute kind of terrier and a force of nature, having to kind of get him to do anything that resembled schoolwork was quite tough. I'm not a teacher, and it was proven by this lockdown.
I guess you'll really appreciate teachers from now on. I guess they'll occupy a special star in your firmament.
Yeah, well, they actually always have done. I've always had a lot of kind of respect for teachers in a very different way. And one thing, actually, you know, I'd never thought about talking about this, but just as it came into my mind there when we were talking about teachers, I remember having a teacher. I went to a school in Perth, the academy in Perth, and my teacher in my final couple of years, who taught me modern studies, was a woman called Miss Campbell, Lorna Campbell. Now, in a way, although we didn't use the term back then, she was a bit of a yeser. She liked talking about Scotland, about its kind of independence and its future. But, you know, she's a huge influence on me because she said to me once, what are the things that you're really passionate about? And I was already by then a big fan of soul music. And she started to get me reading about the civil rights movement, about the anti-apartheid movement. And I just thought, this is really exciting. I can actually study these things. And that was ignited for the first time ever, really, at school by this woman who was my modern studies teacher. And we sometimes forget in Scotland that modern studies is a particular element of our curriculum in Scotland, which allows young people to explore politics and kind of the economy and issues around justice and civil rights and things like that. And it's a great, great subject, and it needs to be really protected because I think it gives Scotland a real kind of point of difference from curricula around the world. And it certainly meant a lot to me. It made me much more confident to be able to talk and write about politics the way that I think in any democracy kids should be able to do.
Isn't that interesting? Because much of what you've said echoes what a previous guest said, Billy Kay.
Yeah.
You may recall Billy was brought up in Ayrshire, and because it was frowned upon to use Scots at school, he had two languages, right, from the get-go. From the knee-high to grasshopper, he had two languages. He had Scots, which he spoke up until 9 o'clock in the morning, and then he had another language, which he spoke until 4, and if he reverted to his earlier language, he got the belt. So he became proficient, of course, in both. And he reckons that made it easier for him to pick up languages. But he always appreciated the fact that the Scottish educational system turned out people, whatever social area they happened to come from, it turned out people who had a broad grasp of lots of different subjects, which allowed them to intelligently use a specialisation later because they're already covered the big picture. And it's so much easier to focus on the specific if you know what the big picture looks like.
I certainly felt that when I moved down to England, I went to university in England when I was about 17 and a half. And I say that because I was too young to go into the Union Bar. I was still underage. I managed to busk it quite comfortably. And I remember going down to England, and because most of the people that I was at university with had done the A-level system in England, I'd kind of, in a way, they were, if you like, specialising much earlier than life than I had been. I was still doing 5 hires and my 6-year studies and things like that. So I was still juggling maybe 6, 7 subjects in my school career. And in some respects, I think the generalism of that was a huge advantage when I got to university. Because one of the other things about modern studies is it allowed you to do things like a project, a written project, a project of your choice. You met your teacher almost as in a tutorial. You had small group seminars, all of the things that are part of the rhetoric of studying in university, I'd already done for a year at school in Scotland. So I think it's just a really, really great subject. I'm a very, very kind of big, passionate follower. There's a couple of kind of Twitter feeds where school teachers around Scotland run their modern studies Twitter feeds. And it's there to kind of encourage their kids to pick up on subjects that are about, so for example, as we're speaking just now, Jeff Bezos is in the Congress in America being questioned about his business practices. That's the kind of thing that will be a tweet from, say, the New York Times or whatever. And I follow these, it sounds ridiculous, as a grown man, I'm following a modern studies Twitter feed, even at this stage of my life.
Well, it's not such a bad thing. I mean, we can talk about social media later, perhaps, but I just found it interesting. Your educational path took you through your degree in south of the border, but then you moved on to the States, I gather, and you took degrees there too. Yes, I did. It's kind of slightly embarrassing, this bit, John, because I'm one of these people that over the years has managed to amass numerous kind of degrees, some of them are honorary doctorates and things like that. And I'd been to great universities, Harvard
North Virginia State University, and Wharton University of Pennsylvania. But again, you go back and we didn't, when I was a kid growing up, there was no such thing as the Scottish Parliament. But if you remember, and this is one of the things that I think a lot of people find difficult to fully understand, in England, we had already an independent education system. The education system in Scotland was never part of the Union. It was always something that was independent, if you like, of London. And as a consequence of that, there was the Scottish Education Authority when I was a kid growing up. And they had this very, very attractive thing called a major Scottish studentship. And I think they gave 3 away in any given year. And I applied to do a master's degree in America, and whether it was to do with the quality of the application or the kind of things that I was wanting to study, I was given one of these awards, one of these studentships. And remarkable, it paid for all my upkeep, it paid for my flights to and from America, it paid for all of my reasonable expenses. I mean, something that you just simply wouldn't hear about now. And when I'm talking about a 3-year scholarship to allow you to do the basis of your PhD on a full grant, in the sense of my mother was a widow, which she'd a very low income, so there was no way that I was going to ever get money through my family. But to have won this at an early age was just a big, big, big plus in my life. And I kind of, I don't know who to thank now, because they'll be long since retired, many of them probably dead. But if there's a place in heaven where the Scottish Education Authority resides, thank you very much indeed.
So how did you move from there towards broadcasting in Channel 4?
Yeah. Well, that was a kind of thing that's kind of like odd and circuitous. I came back from the States. I'd been in and out of doing other kinds of little jobs. I worked briefly in higher education. And I'd started to write mostly about African-American music for a newspaper called Echoes. It was like a black music paper. And my work was seen by the then editor of the NME, and a guy called Neil. His name will come back to me. This is terrible. And he was the editor of Neil Spencer. He was the editor of the NME at the time. And he talked me into going and joining the NME. And they paid a transfer fee to Echoes for me because I was an Echoes writer. So literally it was in the form of kind of free adverts and things like that. And I went over to the NME and I was writing principally about black music. And because of my interest in the media and that, I also became the media editor of the NME. And that then meant that lots and lots of TV stations asked you to talk about various things, whether it was kind of in the music scene or the media scene. And it was coincidental at the time. There was a period of time they used to refer to it as the era of trendy telly, when there was kind of Janet Street Porter and all of these people around. They were slightly obsessed with having people that had what they thought authentic accents. So I was often wheeled out just to be their kind of, jock on wheels to come in and talk about it. So that I ended up being on the TV a lot, and then eventually set up an independent production company with a friend and colleague of mine, a guy called Don Coots. We set up a company in Glasgow during 1990. That became very successful quite quickly. We produced The Big Day for Channel 4 and a number of other series, Halfway to Paradise. And then eventually Channel 4 approached me about going to them, and I took that job, and it was a very good move in my life, because although it meant going back down to London, it gave me a long period of time in the heart of broadcasting, in senior management within broadcasting, commissioning, being an executive at Channel 4. And it's given me a kind of perspective on broadcasting, probably, as good as anyone could get. I've been in the belly of the beast, Well, one thing, without kind of quickly going over it, I remember coming home, and you probably know this from reading things about me, John, but I'd grown up in a very Scottish Labour family. My dad, Jack, who died when I was very young, was the agent for the Labour Party in Tayside in the Perthshire and bits of Dundee area. He'd been a union rep, and my mum was very much a Labour Party activist and everything. And so when I first left Scotland, moved down to London, I was just very much in the Labour Party, and not unlike an awful lot of people in Scotland. It was just simply common to me. But I do remember coming home in 1990, 1991 and 92, and I vividly remember getting involved quite quickly in Artists for Independence, which was a pressure group that was around with people like Ricky Ross, Pat Kane, and people like that. And I became involved in that movement. And from then on, it's been a journey about embracing the thought of independence over those decades. There is a photograph, actually, it got dragged up the other day, and I can see my shoulder in the photograph. It's a very, very young Nicola Sturgeon next to a very young George Galloway and a Pat Kane. And then you can see another guy's shoulder, which I'm pretty sure is me, because I remember that demo. It was in George Square. And you just think, God, how the world's moved on, you know?
Hasn't it just? Oh, my word. See, we've had a couple of questions already. We can perhaps come back to the theme of this if you want to talk to them right now, or you might want to leave them for later. There's a question that's come in on email from, make sure I get his name, Mike Fennick. Yeah. And he's saying, can Stuart please comment on the likes of RT, Russia Today, I guess, Al Jazeera, France 24, etc. Are they as free of bias as as other broadcasters? He actually names a broadcaster here, but I won't go down that route necessarily.
Well, look,
what's your take?
Well, look, one of the things that has happened in the world of broadcasting has been what you might call the miniaturization of the means of production of broadcasting. The fact that just now we are broadcasting to Scotland via a system that's readily available has kind of changed broadcasting forever. Now, the origins of that, I mean, you could go back decades and kind of point to how camera technology has changed. But one of the key changes was when CNN was set up in America. And CNN was based in Atlanta in Georgia, and of course became involved in the first of the Gulf Wars, and then suddenly this new 24-hour news channel was around. Quite a lot of the images, kind of because there was kind of bombing and war and things like that, a lot of the imagery was indistinct, but you were really getting the sense that you were there and you were hearing and you were being updated. And I think in lots of ways that sense of 24-hour news or the always-on kind of media era is with us now in a big way. And so a lot of these channels, and you've mentioned three there, have changed the way in which world broadcasting works. Al Jazeera is an extremely good example of that, where they seem much, much, much more knowledgeable about the nuances of different nations within the Middle East than, say, would be the case with any British broadcaster. And whilst Channel 4 News might be capable of doing, a very, very decent piece, they're not in that area. They don't have a reporter in the Middle East day in, day out, every day. So they're never going to have that kind of nuance that Al Jazeera can bring. And I think it's too easy just to jump then and say, oh, well, these channels are biased. That comes from the set of thinking that often you don't understand exactly the culture that they're coming from. And there are plenty of stations in the world that are funded by, reprehensible people, many of them, quite a lot of the TV stations around the world are run by billionaires, or they're run by the controlling instincts of a government. And there's we're seeing a lot of stuff just now in Hungary, where the Hungarian government are virtually controlling the media in a very direct way. So every nation has its own specificity. And I just feel that to some extent, we ought to often step back from that and say, where are there strengths in Scottish culture and Scottish broadcasting, and where are we weak? Well, one of the areas that we're getting increasingly better at is digital media. It's kind of interesting. Like if you look at your own project just now, but even yesterday I noticed that Scotia had launched a crowdfunder. I work with the Big Light Network doing podcasts. These things are new. They were not. It was not possible to do these things 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that there's a lot of hopefulness there in emergent media, and maybe the days of kind of ultra big controlling broadcasters are top down and have maybe a kind of colonial attitude towards the world. Maybe those days are disappearing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, we've had a question from Lynn Finlayson, and Lynn is asking, Stuart, do you think Scotland should have its own independent news channel?
Unquestionably, I think that Scotland should have its independent broadcasting culture. I think that would be the right thing for any modern independent nation. And if you look across the world and you look at the way in which different the way in which different expectations are placed on broadcasters. You look at Denmark or Norway, any of the Scandi countries, they all have a different broadcasting culture than the one we have in Scotland. Let me tell you a little anecdote. I remember that I'd been asked by a TV2 in Denmark if I would be effectively what you would have called in the university days the external examiner. I was the person they brought in to look at their programme, to talk about their head of their programmes, to test which of their shows were kind of working for them and which weren't. And it was really just it was part of the requirement of their regulation within Danish broadcasting. And I remember arriving at an airport. It was actually Copenhagen. I'd gone to the airport there to be met by the head of programs, and I was taken to their studio. Now, what's quite interesting about this is we did this kind of 2-hour workshop with him, and then he says, I would love you to talk to our independent producers. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. Just tell me what you need me to do. And he said, well, we've got a helicopter for you, a helicopter pad near the studio. And then I was flown to Odense, or Unza as they call it, and was taken in to speak to this 100 producers. And I said, why did I go to Unza? And the guy just simply said, we're required by law not to do everything at our HQ, and some of our best producers are based in Unza. Now, the equivalent of that is having an HQ in Glasgow and having to fly on a helicopter to, say, Dundee or Aberdeen to talk to producers. That's actually a good thing. It sounded a wee bit mad at the time I was doing it, but I fully understood that they come under quite a lot of pressure to regionalise their news output. In Denmark, they have a regional broadcast. Every hour there's a 10-minute insert into their main news for regional areas of Denmark. Now, people would say, well, could we do that and all the rest of it? One of the big problems that we've got in Scotland is a nation, but it's also a nation of regions. And I think there's an awful lot of people outside the Central Belt in Scotland that don't feel that they get value from money from their broadcaster, whether that's their licence fee or whether it's through advertised funded TV. They just don't see their area on television enough, and I think that should change.
It raises the obvious question: why isn't the BBC doing this in news and current affairs?
Well, I think that the news and current affairs at the BBC has so many different challenges, and I think a lot of them are real challenges, which probably can't be resolved within the current kind of system and setup. One of the big things about it is that news and current affairs in London is probably the most powerful directorate within the BBC. So if you look at the current Director General, Lord Hall, he's worked within that directorate almost all of his adult life, apart from periods out at the Royal Opera House. And it just kind of is in his bones. And there has always been a tendency to see Yorkshire and Scotland and Northern Ireland as effectively outposts. I remember when I took on the job of Director of Nations and Regions at Channel 4, the magazine that runs the broadcasting industry, or one of the big magazines, Broadcast Magazine, said in the feature, there was a management change at Channel 4, and it said, Cosgrove has been pushed sideways to Director of Nations and Regions. I got a 50 grand. I got a 50 grand a year increase when I was pushed sideways, and that was the time when I was allowed to open an office in Scotland and have my own team and staff based in Glasgow. For me, it was one of the most exciting things I'd ever done in my life. But the ideological mindset was that if you're going to work in Scotland, you're kind of going further down the food chain. BBC Scotland has to fight for that all the time. It doesn't have absolute control over its schedule. It doesn't have absolute 100% control over the decisions it takes about whether it does specialist news at a particular time. It doesn't have an absolute control of when it opts in and out of the schedule. So, for example, big events like, for example, probably the biggest ones would have been in our lifetime, maybe Dunblane or Lockerbie, these kind of epic, big public tragedies or public incidents. You need your broadcaster and the people who are in that area to take their decisions about what's right for their viewers and not have to kind of defer that to decisions taken, 500 mile away in the London centre, who I think in both of those cases knew it was a big story. But there are other stories that break in Scotland, not of that scale, but deserve dedicated kind of news coverage. So I think that there's quite a lot of challenges there. A lot of people think I'm a wee bit kind of soft on the BBC. Other people think I'm the person that speaks the truth within the BBC. But one of the things is I think we're in a very complex period just now. If you look at the last white paper in the run-up to independence, it said within it that the assets, the staff and the assets of the BBC in Scotland would be transferred over to a standalone broadcasting company called the Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, which would be an independent broadcasting corporation. Were that to be in the next manifesto when we go to the next referendum, and that's the basis on which Scotland negotiates media independence, I want that organisation to be as well resourced and as good as it can possibly be, because it will have the basis within it of what will be a new independent Scottish Broadcasting Corporation. And I know there'll be people listening to this thinking, no, Stuart, you're wrong. What about him? What about her? What about him saying this? And what about that? And I know all of that, but we need a really, really solid Scottish Broadcasting Corporation if we find ourselves in the position of being an independent nation.
That would seem to make a lot of sense to a lot of people, I suspect. I mean, the impression lots of people get just now is that the approach that they see it could only be described as colonial. In fact, the way you describe it sounds colonial, i.e. I'm at the centre, I am omnipotent, and I will, from time to time, indulge you. But there's nothing formalised about it. It seems to be determined by that sort of mindset, which is combined perhaps, and I'd very much like your views on this if you wouldn't mind, it strikes me it stems from a lack of democratic accountability. In other words, where the broadcaster reports to an entity such as the SBC that you describe, that would seem to me to be an appropriate relationship.
Well, in every other nation, I mean, this is clearly a period of democratic change that we're going through. And interestingly enough, when devolution was first being imagined and when the process of devolving powers to Scotland, some of which we already had in areas like health and education, others of which were new powers to the new Scottish Parliament, one of the things that the centre, if you like, in terms of the mindset of what had to be maintained, broadcasting was one of the things that they were determined had to remain. Now you can interpret that any which way you like, but even that has changed because in London, gradually the BBC, which was run effectively by a board of directors as a trust, eventually came under pressure within London itself to become overseen and regulated by Ofcom, the Office of Communications, the regulator in London, which is also the regulator that oversees Channel 4, Channel 5, ITN News and other public service licenses. So the BBC is now falling under that area of regulation. There is an argument that actually broadcasting should and could be devolved to Scotland. I think the time for that probably isn't now, because it feels like one of the things we're going to have to be doing in the next few months is fighting the idea that powers we thought were there and were ours to be part of our democracy are going to be taken back off us as part of the internal market Brexit settlement. So there's quite a fight there, and I don't think now's the time when we can say, oh, actually, we want more powers. We're going to have to defend the powers that we've got whilst we move towards a second referendum. And I think that therefore means that who would regulate the Scottish Broadcasting Corporation? And I would personally prefer, I'm interested in light touch regulation, but Ofcom are a very good regulator in as much as they're based on, they regulate because of kind of evidence. They're evidence-based. So if they say mobile phones are taking over children's kind of playtime or the time that they spend doing things, they don't just assert that. They go away and research it very deeply for 6 months and then come back and say, yes, it is now a matter of fact, we can say that X, Y, and Z happened. And I like evidence-based regulation, but I also like light touch regulation. I don't think people should be hanging over your shoulder telling you what you can and can't say on air. And so for Scotland, I would want to see a regulator between the Parliament and the broadcasters.
I think the points you were making were about the composition of a Scottish Broadcasting Corporation.
Yeah.
I mean, it would seem to me that it would be terribly important that such an entity would be essentially very democratic. You know, that represents a full spectrum of opinion. Is that something you feel would be important?
Well, yeah, of course. And I feel that if you look actually at the producers' guidelines of the BBC as they're currently constituted, quite a lot of people jump to the whole idea about balance and objectivity and all of those kinds of things. And whilst they're an important part of the BBC's guidelines, there is another one that doesn't get nearly as much attention, and that's what they refer to as diversity of opinion. Because actually, you know, in an intelligent democracy, you want to listen to a show where there's a diversity of opinion, a range of opinions, people challenging, you know, because let's be honest, although, you know, the people that might be watching this Independence Live may share a passion for Scottish independence, it would be naive to think that we all think the same things. You know, we'll have different views on endless subjects that, you know, that we want to see within an independent Scotland. And we know that the Yes movement, you know, which is, you know, one of the kind of most uplifting things that's happened in decades in Scotland, that some of that is coming from the women's movement, so Women for Independence, a lot of people coming from the left, a lot of people coming from environmental areas of our society. So the Yes movement and the independence movement is a very diverse movement, and you want that kind of diversity reflected in your broadcasting. But here's another thought, which is one that one thing that makes it kind of difficult for people to fully understand is I'm committed to the idea of any modern broadcaster now being a publisher broadcaster. A publisher broadcaster is a station like Channel 4, which hires all sorts of commissions, all sorts of independent producers to make its content. Because diversity of opinion in a democracy is fine, but you also need diversity of supply. You need people bringing your programs from a range of different backgrounds, experiences, places. And I think that in the new Scotland, that would be something that I would definitely argue for and advocate. So the final point I was making, John, was that I think that a new broadcasting corporation would commission much more out to independent production. And that's not always something that makes you popular with colleagues, but the Channel 4 system, which is a system based on diversity of supply, is that commissioning companies, independent companies, are commissioned to make content, including actually the Channel 4 News, which is commissioned out on a 2 and 3 year contract. And I think that stops you having that kind of, you know, there's a danger within any institution. And this is not just true of the BBC. We know that across institutions, across our entire public life, they can become animals of their own creation. They can have their own internal behaviours, and sometimes it's a good thing to actually shift and change the way in which they are required to source content.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Talking about diversity, as you did just a couple of seconds ago there, what are your thoughts on we're having this poll to talk about whether there ought to be a statue for Andrew Watson? What's your view?
Well, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of statues per se, although one thing I would say is I love public art when it's creative and imaginative, and I think that Andrew Watson is certainly somebody that we in Scotland should cherish, should remember, should historicise, should give greater kind of knowledge to. His story should be a story that's told within our education system, and you could see how that could be told within a programme of activity predicated on slavery and reparations and all of those kinds of debates. And so it's a really interesting area for people to study. So I'd want to see him being a much more active person in our public history and in the way in which we think of him. It is a remarkable story that a young black Scot should captain Scotland and be one of our greatest players of all time, probably. But the era that he lived in preceded television, preceded the kind of glamour that football now has. And so he's virtually unknown except to people that are very passionate about Scottish history. So yes, I'd love to see him celebrated more, but maybe in the form of kind of public art, or rather than kind of a block statue. But that's a kind of debate for people that curate and commission public art in Scotland.
Yeah.
So, you look at the difference that, for example, in Falkirk at the Wheel, you look at the great kind of public art that's there has literally transformed that area as a tourist attraction. And I think that public art can have that transformational quality, and that's how I would like to see Andrew Watson remembered, rather than there being a statue in in a square somewhere.
Yeah, I was having a discussion with some people just the other day there, and one of the thoughts that emerged was picking up the point you just made about education.
Yeah.
And Black Lives Matter, and perhaps there ought to be, one of the suggestions were, amongst many others, was some sort of essay competition, for example, across Scotland, to encourage kids to talk and think about the whole empire bit, the fact that in many respects Watson had a very privileged upbringing.
Yes.
But yet, unlike many with a privileged upbringing, he exploited that to the fullest. I mean, and that lovely story about when he moved to London, he was poached by Corinthians.
Yes.
I mean, who couldn't write about that? With give people a chance to test their eloquence when it comes to a specific. Can we turn to your books for a second? Talk about those, Stuart.
Yeah, well, for a second, you might need 4 hours for this, John. I've got a number of different books that are out there and have been, I've actually, if I was honest with you, I've had a really, really successful last couple of weeks, because books are not just about the writing of them, it's about all the kind of other opportunities that they throw up. So probably the biggies in my life just now is a new book that's coming out in the next month called Cassius X, and the preceding 3 books, the Soul Trilogy, Detroit 67, Memphis 68 and Harlem 69. They're all books about the story of soul music against the backdrop of the last years of the 60s. Civil rights, black power, the war in Vietnam, the secret state trying to undermine black activism within the American ghettos. A whole range of really, really big historic subjects, and something I'm really, really passionate about. And those books sell very well, but importantly, all of them have been picked up by producers, mostly in America, some here in the UK, with the view to them being made into either documentaries or dramas within the current streaming system with Netflix, Amazon Prime, and those kinds of organisations. and it's kind of exciting. But I found out yesterday that the Cassius X book is going to be simultaneously published in America with a Chicago publishing company. And yesterday I also got news that it had been bought by a German, very big German company, and will be translated into German. So when Cassius X comes out, it's going to be in the biggest kind of marketplaces currently around in America and in Germany. So there's an element of kind of being proud of that, but also it helps you kind of visibly to kind of move on to the next stage of things that you want to do, you know.
Yeah. And remind me again, when is your book out?
The book's out in a month's time. It's called Cassius X and a Legend in the Making. It's a period of time in 1963 when Muhammad Ali, as he became known, is beginning to convert to Islam, and is kind of, a lot of people are kind of fighting over his kind of reputation. Malcolm X, Sam Cooke, his girlfriend, soul singer Dee Dee Sharp. And it's the very early days of soul music, as soul music's just emerging. So in many respects, it could be seen to my hardcore fans as a kind of prequel to the trilogy. But it's a book in its own right. You know, the good thing about it is I get asked every single day of my life when I'm dealing with American publishers, how do you know, where's this come from? How do you know so much? How does a guy from Scotland have all of this kind of knowledge of African American history and all the rest of it? And I just say to them, modern studies. It's a good subject.
But I mean, it seems very topical too. It seems to resonate with the extraordinary event of the Unites just now. It seems to me that the timing is fantastically.
Yeah, the timing and the connection to what you might call the kind of global zeitgeist of the events that have happened in America. That you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the kind of what they call in America building the breach, or who will repair the breach. It's more of a kind of Christian movement, repairing the breach, but it's an equivalent of Black Lives Matter. And they ask the question, when all of this stuff's over, whether it's the Hurricane Katrina and the levees, whether it's, you know, police violence, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic, who will repair who will repair the breach? Who will repair all of the kind of mistakes that have been made? And in some respects, that's not just an issue to be asked about African American experience. It's something I think we'll start asking globally ourselves about how we're all managed and how we're led. And in some respects, although it's a hugely controversial thing in the mind of some people, I think that if you look at the way that Nicola Sturgeon's handled the pandemic in terms of her clarity and her dedication to the cause, and actually her, you know, refusal to be distracted by all the other people that are trying to distract her, it's actually a masterclass in how to run your way through a crisis, you know.
Yeah, it's been very impressive. She posted sniping from all sides, pretty much.
Yeah,
it takes a lot of nerve to keep focused while you're being heavily criticised for doing what you think is an important job. But you could argue that's true for every senior executive. That's what comes with the territory.
That comes with the territory. If you don't want to do the gig, don't take money.
don't absolutely. Well, I was asking the question before we were so rudely interrupted by the inadequacies of technology. Where you thought the independence movement was going, the Yes movement?
First and foremost, I don't think there can be much doubt in people's mind that the opinion polls over the last 6 months to almost a year have shown a kind of settled position for the, if you like, the Yes movement as being comfortably on 50 or above 50%, which is higher than we've ever been in our history. And that's got to be something that we hugely welcome and push further and see where it can take us. I mean, there is, of course, the very well-known thesis that quite a lot of people in the Yes campaign put forward, which is, you know, we know from 2014 that this is a great grassroots movement and that they can push and communicate and nudge people further. And I think we've got another 2 or 3% to go. I would love to think that we could go into an independence referendum with the opportunity to get 60%. And then, of course, it just simply becomes game over. But, anything above Brexit will do for me. And I would go further than that, John. I think a lot of other things are kind of falling into place for Scotland in ways that, we hadn't ever imagined. I don't think any of us really imagined that Boris Johnson and his cabinet would be so aggressive in their and actually so poorly organised in terms of the way in which they dealt with the pandemic. And that's given Nicola Sturgeon, whether she does or doesn't want this, it's made her to look a much more formidable leader than Johnson. That's been a big thing. I think there's another thing as well, which is to do with, to begin with, I had a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people that are part of the TNT show would think, what's this about Ruth Davidson being handed a kind of peerage, or if that actually goes through. There's another side of me that can see a big upside in that, because it's a statement of fact that the government in London are completely out of touch with what opinions are in Scotland, and they'll take these decisions to effectively overrule democracy, because the next logical step would be to put Ruth Davidson into the cabinet as Secretary of State for Scotland, and that would just be another very public display of not caring about the democracy.
We're back.
How are you?
Sorry about that, Stuart. You were in full flow there, and all of a sudden I disappeared. And anyway, we can sort that out later. You're saying that there might be a confluence of different factors that might help the whole process move towards a positive result.
Yeah, I think very much so that in some respects you can see that different things are not in any way directly connected, but the idea that Ruth Davidson being fast-tracked into the House of Lords in order to kind of, in a way, provide there being what in England they think she's a big figure in the kind of Scottish political system, and I think that may end up looking as if they don't actually care about the democracy of Scotland. It's just another way of manipulating the system. And I think that will not play well with... There's a lot of people in Scotland that are still kind of yet to be convinced. But some of those people will be Democrats. They'll be people that say... it's quite interesting that when asked the question, about the Scottish Parliament and its powers, as many as 80% of Scots want the Scottish Parliament to be here. They want it to be relevant, and they want it to be powerful. That's a huge number of people. That's much bigger than the 54% of people that say they want an independent Scotland. So that means that there's 20-odd% of Scots that are willing to be convinced around the democracy of Scotland and our own parliament. And I think that's a big, big, big chunk of people that can be won over to the yes movement.
In conclusion, a very big thank you. It's kind of you to be with us, be so eloquent and all the technical issues we've had. And I thank you for that, Stuart, most sincerely. And a big thanks to all of you out there. I hope you've enjoyed the TNT show to the extent that you could hear it and listen to us. We again have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. Brian Cox, arguably Scotland's leading actor, we hope will join us next week. And look out for the Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. And very importantly, support India Live, India Live Radio. It is for a new Scotland and for all the news that you feel you might not be getting. If you like the TNT show, please support India Live now. It's been a great day for British democracy. Bye all.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Ending like God